Having got my flight bow in a state where it can be tested, I need some flight arrows. Now, I'm going through two lines of attack. I'm using pine that has been heated and compressed, and I'm also using cane that's been split down, well, sawn down and re-glued. Now, I don't claim that any of this is new or novel, but it may be of interest. And I know that flights and flight arrows are rather niche, but it might be useful to someone. This was my test rig for compressing the pine shafts. Now, it did work, but sort of only just with a bit of help. What I did was I raised this lower bit of tube and held it in position with a G-clamp, blasting hot air from a heat gun down there to preheat these sections. I steamed the shaft for a good long time. It was about roughly ½ inch square. Popped it in there, jacked it up really hard and compressed it to about 75% of its original thickness. Now, it did work, but to improve it I've bought two jacks, which I haven't unwrapped yet, so I can have one at either end, and they're 5 ton rather than 2 ton jacks. And I've got some insulating blanket that I'm going to glue and drape over here. But it certainly worked, and here's the first shaft I've been working on, and that was pine, and it's nicely compressed, and I've got that a narrower diameter than I've had a flight arrow before. And you'll also recognise the usual sort of arrow tapering jig where you adjust these jaws. It's got the coarse grit paper in there, and you run your shaft down there either using an electric drill, or in my case I clamp it in my lathe. But the problem with that is it's easy to have it bind up and exert too much force, and I've twisted shafts in half. That's not easy to say. So I made this little jig, which works remarkably well. Just an old brass hinge glued onto some ply at about the right sort of thickness, so these jaws are almost parallel. Just wrapped some coarse grit paper around there, held on at the back with screws, and of course you can squeeze that in your fingers and you can feel the pressure you're applying as you put it over the shaft. It's long enough to be straightening out any undulations and flattening them and rounding them, but it's also small enough to clear the dust nicely and to remove quite big amounts of timber, because I had been using this dowel cutter that I got off the internet, which is fine for ripping the shaft down to about 8mm, but with pine it tends to tear. I tried making a smaller one out of a block of oak, but it was a nightmare. I found sanding vastly more effective, and this little jig works really well. That is highly recommended. Easy to knock up, works really well. You've got the feel that you don't have when you're using a big jig like that. Anyhow, I've also finished my first split cane arrow. Now that is much smaller diameter than I've ever had before. I've got a little knock insert and a fine binding fine linen thread soaked in super glue. The fletchings are actually some brown paper. Sort of brown paper from the inside of a roll of wrapping paper. It's had super glue, low viscosity super glue run over it, and it goes quite crisp and hard. And I made a little curved knife tool to chop out my fletchings. Bit of old bandsaw blade. Put the paper on a block of wood, put that over the top, whack it with a hammer. Anyway, there's the result you can see. So I realise this video is a bit niche for a lot of people, but if it gives you some ideas and helps you making arrows, it will be useful. I don't like making arrows, and in one of the previous flight bow videos I showed how I'd done these quartered cane arrows. It is possible to make forgewood, as it was called, in your own garden or your own garage or whatever. So compressing and heating does work. Of course the problem is it gives you a heavy shaft. It gives you a nice stiff shaft that you can take down to a lower diameter, but it gives you the weight. But that's the dilemma with flight arrows. Theoretically you want the smaller diameter as possible for minimum air resistance, and you want them to weigh as little as possible to go fast, but you need a certain amount of weight to get them to carry the distance. And this one actually weighs less than 200 grams. I think it was about 180. 20 inch long for the flight bow. Anyway, there you go. Bye bye.